In this video, we will cover running a custom DAG with Airflow. If you've installed the video repository, you have all the files necessary to run this workflow. This workflow is an example that takes a Twitter search term and it saves the tweets to a file. Then it's going to move those tweets into a database and uses some simple data analysis to pull out the most popular links from the tweets. To run this DAG, you'll need authorization credentials from twitter.com. You can set up a simple app and authorize it in a few steps at apps.twitter.com. In the main repository root folder, you should already have a config folder, and in that config, you'll want to set up a file with all of your own Twitter keys. The example config file from the repository will point you to the naming conventions that are used. So here we can see that there's a few globals set up at the top of the file, and again, here's the config file global. It's going to point to the base directory in a folder called config to prod.cfg. Obviously, if you want to change that, it's fine and you can do so here. Before we run our custom DAG, we're going to take a look at the different tools and review a bit about Airflow architecture in the process. So we can see just from looking at our imports here that we're going to use a few different types of Airflow classes. We have, of course, DAG, which is our primary DAG object. In Airflow, no task exists on their own. They're only found when they're registered to at least one DAG. So obviously DAG is going to be pretty essential to us. We're also importing several operators, here email and Python, and we're importing a hook, which is the SQLite hook. And we'll see a little bit about the differences of those as we go through the file. There's also many other things that we're using. We're using some pandas, we're using Tweepy to search Twitter, and some other standard library things. So if we start looking down, one of the first things that you usually find in an Airflow file is the definition of the DAG. So here we have the default arguments. In these, again, a lot of these things can be set and changed. We have the start date, which is 4 days ago. It's important to note that the start date needs to be either something defined by a datetime object in the past, or it needs to always start at least one interval behind the actual schedule interval. So you'll notice here that I'm using 4 days ago. If this were set to datetime.now and the schedule interview here down in the DAG was set to something like daily or weekly, then what would happen is the scheduler would call the file every time to see, hey, is now the time that I can run it? And every time it would say that it's starting now. So it would never get evaluated and therefore never run. So it's important to think about a little bit of these architecture constraints and determine what makes sense for your DAG. So our first DAG here is called Twitter links, which is the ID, and we're passing in the default arguments. And here we have some retries again for our arguments, and we also have our schedule interval set to daily. There's a few of these nice little syntactic sugar they give you, for example, once, daily, weekly, things like that. So depending on how you need to run it, you can either specify an exact time interval, or you can use one of their easy at dailies or something like that. So if we skip over the bulk of the logic and scroll down to see the actual operators, you can go through these at a later time. I recommend you do so. It's basically extracting our data, and it's the code that will search Twitter as well as store the files. And we have some conversion to SQLite, and we have some pandas logic. And when we get here down to the bottom of the file, we can actually see declaring our operators. And again, for this, we're using primarily Python operators, but I want to remind you that there's plenty of different operators. There's SQL operators, there's Hive operators, Hadoop operators. There's quite a lot of different operators available. So depending on what your work uses, what your project uses, or what you like to use for fun, you don't have to use the Python operator. You can use quite a few. So here we can see, though, that when we define a Python operator, we have a few different keyword arguments. The first thing that I like to define is the task ID. I tend to keep my task IDs the exact same name as my Python callable because this helps me debug and it helps me remember where the code is. We are also using provide context equals true. This is going to give our task that extra DAG context, which we may or may not need. This is kind of any keyword arguments or arguments that are attached directly to the DAG. I also need to call the Python callable, and this is just the function that is in that same file, or you can import it from another file. Then I'm obviously defining my DAG because, again, no task exists until it's part of a DAG. And here I'm using an extra keyword argument called params. It's just a parameter dictionary that I can pass to my task. The dictionary here has a query equal to hashtag Python. The search Twitter function I'm using as my Python callable value is just going to simply search Twitter with that string. So if we scroll down, we can then see another. Move tweets to SQLite. It should look very similar. However, this one does not use the params keyword argument. And then I have the ID popular, which is very similar again. And finally, I have the email links. And here with the email links, we can see that the keyword arguments differ. We can see that I need to set to subject, HTML content, and I have some optional arguments. Here I'm including files, and this will be a file attachment. Again, to use the email operator, you're going to have to set up some configuration in your airflow.cfg. There's a section around email that is primarily called email and also has SMTP settings. So you need to set that to something, or you'll need to have a mail server running locally and be able to check your local mail. And finally, in these last lines, we can see where we're actually creating the DAG. So up until this point in time, our DAG just existed, but it didn't have any steps. And now when we set these downstream and upstream commands, we're actually configuring our DAG and saying, okay, these tasks happen first, and then they move downstream into these other tasks. So here we can see the simple search sets the downstream of moving tweets to SQLite. Then the ID popular is setting the upstream of the move tweets to SQLite. So we already know now that it goes simple search to move tweets to SQLite to ID popular, and finally email links here, which has the upstream of ID popular. So one other thing that you'll need to change before you run this is you'll want to set the email to your email. So here I do have it set to my email, but here you'll want to set it to your email so that you can ensure that it runs properly. I already have my web server and my scheduler and my workers running. So I can go here and I can turn on my Twitter links. Now this is again set to run daily, which means it likely won't be scheduled immediately. So I can use my same trigger DAG to call Airflow trigger DAG, and that will schedule a run. So now when I return, I can click on this and I can see it starting to run. And I can see that the steps are exactly as stated before. First, it's going to search Twitter. Then it's going to go to CSV to SQLite, identify the proper links, and email the best links. If anything fails, I can get them here, and I can also see the different logs and the steps. So congratulations, you've been able to run your first DAG. I would take time to look through it. If you want to also see where it's storing the raw tweets, you can look in your data tweets directory. And if you want to make a few modifications, I encourage you to do so. One possible thing would be to calculate the most popular hashtags, or to, instead of the links, provide the most popular tweets. Another option would be to add the queries to the files that you're sending so that you know which query was run. Or another possible option is to add a different step. So if you wanted to, instead of saving or sending an email, you could upload that to the cloud, you could upload it to Google Drive, you could save it into a database that you can check later. So there's a lot of different options for even just modifying the simple DAG, or you can step out on your own and create your own first simple DAG with Airflow. Either way, have fun and happy pipelining.